Welcome to the Books and Travel Podcast. I'm j.f.penn, thriller and dark fantasy author, bringing you escape and inspiration about unusual and fascinating places, as well as the deeper side of books and travel. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page, and if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my ebooks for free at jfpenn.com/free. Hello travellers, I'm j.f.penn, and in today's interview I'm talking to Ashlee Cowles about her walk on the Camino de Santiago. So I've been wanting to walk the Camino for many years, and I'm still intending to do it before my 50th birthday. That gives me 5 more years as I record this, and I want to walk it all, delving deep into the pilgrimage experience. But the Francés route, which is the most famous, is kind of 6 weeks long. It's 600, 700 kilometres. You can see a lot of it depicted in The Way, a film with Martin Sheen, as well as in many books. That route, the Francés, you walk from southern France over the Pyrenees into Spain, and I've been looking at the Mozarabic route, or the Via de la Plata, which starts in Seville and travels north to Salamanca and then west. I love that bottom end of Spain. It's just brilliant. So there are many books on the Camino, and it's probably its own subcategory on Amazon at this point, and I would love to add to the many books on the topic. So why haven't I done it? Well, partly it's really long, and I run my own business and it feels like a big deal. Also, part of me wants to walk it alone, as pilgrimages should be done that way. They are meant to be a challenge, and things are different when you travel alone. So you always meet people, for sure, if you travel alone, but also you don't have the emotional backup, which makes you more resilient. So you're tired and hungry and you're in pain, but you can't cry to your partner or your friend if you're on your own. You just have to sort it out. And my husband is not that keen on walking for that long anyway, so I may well get my wish of walking it alone. And my intention would be to write a journal or a memoir, but also to use it as the basis for a thriller on the route. And I've been thinking about this for years. Seriously, I think I first heard about the Camino when I was about 15. So what's that, 30 years now? It's kind of crazy. And I've looked at it, I've looked at booking it, and I will do it. It's one of those promises, and now I'm glad I'm talking about it on this show, because I'm saying out loud, I'm going to do it by the time I'm 50 and going to sort it out. So in this interview, Ashlee, who has done part of the Camino, talks about her background growing up in a military family and how that has shaped her transitory moves, why the Camino is like the hero's journey, and how it shaped the way she wrote her novel, as well as embracing the pilgrim's spirit and letting go of detailed planning, one of the most challenging aspects of walking several hundred kilometres. Now, we also talked about the idea of pilgrimage when you're not religious, and I consider myself spiritual, but I don't subscribe to any particular religion, and the Camino is Catholic, but you certainly don't need to be a Catholic in order to do it. Any long walk is going to break you down in so many ways, and everyone who walks it seems to be transformed by the way. So all of the Camino routes end up at Santiago de Compostela, which I actually wrote about in Stone of Fire, which is based on the idea of the stones of the apostles left with their remains. And of course, Santiago, St. James, his remains are there, or rumoured to be there. So I researched the cathedral and wrote about it, but still haven't been. So I do look forward to taking photos of it one day. So I hope you enjoy the conversation with Ashlee today, and that it gives you some ideas for your own pilgrimage. Ashlee Cowles is the award-winning author of YA novels Beneath Wandering Stars and Below Northern Lights, as well as Wisdom for the Way, a Camino de Santiago guidebook for the pilgrim's soul. Welcome to the show, Ashlee.
Thanks so much for having me, Jo. It's great to be here.
Oh, thanks for coming on. So start off, tell us a bit more about you and your own geographic history.
Sure. Well, like you said, I'm an author mainly of young adult and historical fiction, and a lot of my writing is rooted in my early life experiences growing up in a military family. So I was born in the United States, and I currently live in northern Michigan, which is where all my extended family is from, going back to the late 1800s. But this is actually the first time I've lived here. I've never actually lived anywhere for more than 3 years at one time. That's actually usually the tour or the assignment length in a military family. You rarely live anywhere for longer than 3 years, and I've just continued that into adulthood. About 3 years, I get the itch to go somewhere else, and that's usually about the time we end up making the change. So I'm still trying to beat that 3 year, see if I could ever get past that 3 year mark. But my dad, he was an officer in the U.S. Army. He was a medevac helicopter pilot. So I ended up spending my formative adolescent years living abroad in Germany. And that's where I fell in love with Europe and with history and with learning about other cultures. And that eventually led me to study abroad in Spain as a college student. And I have an aunt who married a Spaniard and lives in Madrid. So it was great to be able to spend that year living with her. Then, pursued an internship at a peacemaking organization in Belfast, and then did a master's degree at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. So I've done some, shorter excursions to Central America, to Africa, to the Middle East. But I think because I spent those, very visceral, formative young adult years living in Europe, that's the region that really feels like a second home. And I just always have this longing to return.
Oh, wow. Well, I know what you mean about that 3 year itch.
Yes.
And we bought a house this year, and I haven't owned a house for a long time. And it was funny because I had this real feeling of, oh no, what about when I want to move? And then I was like, no, it's okay. You can rent it out. You're still free. It's fine.
Yes. We just bought our first home, and I had very similar feelings like, what happens in 3 years? They say you stay for at least 5.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's so interesting. Many of the people I talk to on the show have this similar sort of feeling. But so it's interesting. So you were in Spain and Germany. So do you speak German or Spanish?
Poorly, and I wish I could, being American, that's one of the big downsides is you don't get to keep it up for very long. If once you move back to the States and don't have the opportunity to use it. So I did as a teen, I spoke German well enough to get around. But I actually had a even stranger kind of subculture experience of living on a U.S. Army base, going to an American high school that was in Germany. We would, I was a soccer player, and we would go, play military schools in Lakenheath, England. We would go into Belgium and Italy. And so we had, all these traveling experiences, but it was still very much a typical American high school experience, just with this international flavor to it. So, I can get by with German and Spanish, but not as well as I'd like.
Oh, that's an interesting subculture as well. I mean, the military kid one, and also the military kid in Europe, which is great. So today we're really talking about the Camino de Santiago. So first of all, in case people don't know, what is that, and why write about that after all of the other things you've done?
Yeah, well, the Camino is a pilgrimage route. Actually, it's several pilgrimage routes. There's not just one, but the Camino Francés is the most well known, the most popular. It dates back to the early Middle Ages, and it's really experiencing a kind of rebirth recently. It's extremely popular walking route that people from all over the world travel. I know it's been very popular in Europe for the last decade or so, but it's really just, I think, starting to catch on in North America. And it's just this very interesting experience of a hike, a trek, but it's so much more than that. There's a very personal, interior, spiritual component. There's a cultural component and the historical one. You're seeing all these wonderful sites and monasteries and churches, dating back to the Middle Ages. But it's also a very social experience. So it's quite a mixture. And I first explored the Camino when I was a college student studying in Spain, and actually had an opportunity to take a class on medieval pilgrimage. And what the professor would do is he rented a van. There were only like 8 of us in the class. And so he would rent a van, and every weekend after our classes in Madrid, we would go up to the Camino and we would explore different sections of the route. So we weren't really walking it as pilgrims, but we had this very knowledgeable guide who would take us to specific historical and religious sites, and we would get to really explore them in depth. So that was my first exposure to the Camino, and my first attempt to write a novel set on the Camino. It was actually a historical novel. But as is the case with many first novels, I wasn't really there yet as a writer. So that story never made it out into the world. And then in 2011, I actually went back to the Camino and walked about 200 kilometers of it as a pilgrim. And that's where I got the idea to write a young adult novel, from the perspective of a teen who had a similar upbringing to me, who lived this kind of unique, somewhat bizarre cross-cultural experience as a military brat, as we're affectionately known. But then I think what happened is, as I was walking the Camino, of course, with the novel, something has to happen to this character. So I had her background in mind. But I had been, learning a lot about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And it struck me as I was walking the Camino that the hero's journey is actually really built into the geography of the Camino. So pilgrims will often talk about there being 3 stages to any pilgrimage on the Camino. So if you start out where, most pilgrims start out in the Pyrenees, it's a difficult, rugged terrain, but it's this very breathtaking, beautiful scenery. You start out with lots of energy. That's kind of your call to adventure, where you have a lot of enthusiasm. And then about the middle of the Camino, there's this section known as the Meseta. And it's very flat and arid and dry. And a lot of pilgrims talk about actually experiencing an internal Meseta, an internal desert as well. So thinking about, the abyss as part of the hero's cycle, the hero's journey. And then when you reach the end of the Camino, you arrive in the region of Galicia, which is this very lush, green, beautiful place, also mountainous again. And then you arrive to your destination, the cathedral in Santiago, and it's this kind of experience of rebirth. So I guess that's where the idea began, is just thinking, what, the structure of a story is actually built into the geography of this route. And so that's where I got the idea for Beneath Wandering Stars, is this kind of coming of age novel that pulls in my own history growing up into a military family, but also, the history and culture and geography of the Camino.
Oh no, that's fantastic. And like you, all my novels are like, oh, here's a character doing this thing, and it might be related to me in some way.
Yes.
And the place might have been somewhere I traveled to. So yeah, winding our travels into our books, I think is really good. So just in case people, you mentioned the Pyrenees, but just to set the Camino in the world. So the Francés is the southern France. You start in France, don't you? And then you walk over the Pyrenees, and it's across northern Spain to kind of the northwest side where Santiago is. But yes, there are other Camino routes, aren't there? You mentioned a little bit, but are there, what are some of the other routes that people can walk? There's, these little tributaries that go out into the rest of Europe. I remember walking the Camino and meeting a German who had walked from Germany. It's not as well worn and clearly marked the entire way, but there are, these ancient routes that go to different countries. My brother-in-law, when he turned 18, he, as kind of his, rite of passage into adulthood experience, he walked through Portugal to Santiago.
So there's routes along the northern coast of Spain as well. So instead of walking the French way, which again is the most popular, the most common route, you can walk along a coastal path in northern Spain. So there really are many. We talk about the Camino, but there really are many, many Caminos, and they all, the end point is Santiago, but you can start in many different locations.
And we were in Spain recently and read about the Moorish route, the Arabic route, which is sort of Granada, Sevilla, up that route through Andalusia, and that they've just kind of done that up and made it clearer, because as you say, it's amazing how popular some of these are becoming. And I wanted to just mention that because, the Camino de Santiago does get very busy, that Francés route now, especially in, is it the year when the Pope, Jubilee year, when all your sins are forgiven?
Yes, if there's any kind of holy year or festival taking place, that is going to be
it's super busy. Avoid the Jubilee, I would say, unless you need all your sins forgiven.
Yes.
But so tell us a bit more. So you said you walked 200 kilometers of it, and it is about 600 kilometers, the Francés, isn't it? So was that just the lot? And of course, 200 kilometers is a long way. People listening and going, whoa, that's a long way. So tell us a bit more about that. How long did it take you, and what were some of the highlights of that section?
Well, that took us about 2 weeks. And I really would love to go back and walk, the entire thing, or as like you've mentioned, one of the less traveled routes, less popular routes. But it's interesting because I do feel like I have been to most parts of the Camino. So even though I haven't walked it all in a linear way, I feel like I've kind of had that experience of being in the Pyrenees and then going through the Meseta. But I definitely would like to do it all at once at some point. But some of my favorite places were Ocebrero is one of the most memorable, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's this quaint little village in Galicia that's filled with it has these ancient round Celtic huts. They look like little hobbit houses. And it's one of the hardest days of climbing on the entire Camino, but it's very much worth it. The views, it's just a beautiful place. And for me, it was one of those traveling experiences where you visit the same place on two different occasions, and you get to see how the experiences can be radically different. So the first time was, again, as part of that course as a college student. And we actually arrived by van at night. So we drove up to the village, and it was in the autumn, and it was this very rainy, misty night that it kind of cast this very otherworldly atmosphere on the village. It was also very empty at the time, and we kind of walked into this little town square looking for our hotel, and there's bagpipe music blaring from a souvenir shop, but there's nobody around, and we're looking at each other like, is this Spain? Where are we? This feels, we've entered Ireland or Scotland or something. So it's definitely not, what most people picture when they think of Spain. And then the second time I actually hiked up to that same village during my Camino trek, and it was late May. It was this beautiful sunny day. It was very crowded, and I was walking with friends at the time, and so we ended up enjoying wine and caldo gallego, this very rustic soup in this little stone restaurant that felt like a medieval tavern. So, just two very different experiences. And I love that, when you travel a lot and you have a chance to go back to the same place, it's interesting to see how different it can be, in the later visits.
So, and you mentioned some of the historical places, the monasteries or the churches. Were there any specific sort of architectural things that you thought were beautiful or interesting?
Yes. So there's two off the beaten path places, literally, because they're not on the main Camino Francés, but you can, they're not too difficult to get to from the Camino. So they're kind of little side trips. One is the monastery of San Juan de la Peña, which is in the Pyrenees. And it's this really amazing 10th century structure, and it's built like right into the rock, into the side of the mountain. And it actually has a lot of Moorish influences, which, you see a lot of in southern Spain, as you mentioned, but you don't see a whole lot in northern Spain. So it's a very interesting, just interesting historical site to visit. There's also the Church of Saint Mary of Iunate, which is in Navarra, and it's a small church built. It's built into the shape of an octagon, and it is believed to have some connection to the Knights Templar. And it's just one of those mysterious, thin places that you just feel something when you're there. My favorite scene from my novel is actually was set at that place. So those are two of the historic places that I would recommend people look into that aren't maybe as well known, or, they're definitely not on the main Camino trail.
I do exactly the same thing. If I have a lot of scenes set in amazing churches because I think they're so amazing. So obviously walking 200 kilometers for some people, or the full 600, this is a physical challenge in itself. So talk us through, some of the challenges, whether physical or mental, that people might have on the Camino, and also any tips for dealing with those.
Sure. Well, I would definitely encourage people, while walking the Camino, you see people of all ages and, physical abilities. There are people in their 70s walking the Camino. You can really take it as slow as you'd like. There definitely are physically challenging parts, but it's not, as challenging as some of the treks out there. I think more of the challenges tend to be emotional or internal, and I think that's part of what makes it a pilgrimage. So for a type A control freak like me, I'm someone who enjoys planning the trip almost as much as going on the trip. So letting go of that need to kind of plan out everything in advance and know exactly where we're going to stop and where we're going to stay. That was just kind of embracing the pilgrim spirit was one of the hardest parts for me. But physically, I think if you do a bit of walking in advance, if you pack as lightly as you can, that's those first few days, your pack feels very, very heavy. But it gets lighter as time goes on. And people, start to ditch things that they realize they didn't really need in the first place. A good pair of boots. A lot of pilgrims will tell you that, because blisters is probably you're going to be your greatest enemy on the Camino. But I think if you can really kind of maybe let go of the need to arrive at a certain place at a certain time, and slow down a little bit and take it at the pace that you need to, just about anybody can walk the Camino.
Yeah, and I'm very similar to you. I mean, I do not like to not know where I'm sleeping. And one of the things I've heard, especially on those busy times, is you can arrive somewhere and the beds at the hostel might be taken. So yes. How did you deal with that sort of, where do you end up sleeping for the night?
Yes, that was a worry for me as well. And I'll say, it not turning out too well ended up being kind of a funny scene for my novel. So there is always that.
It's always a story.
Yes, there's always a story. But there's the municipal hostels that are less expensive, so those tend to be the most popular, and they can fill up the most quickly. But what I found is that in most places, there's private hostels, there's usually there's bed and breakfast, there's other accommodations. And the Camino, at least the Camino Francés, I can't say this of the less popular routes, because those ones may be a little bit more, there may be, some stretches where there's a bit more distance between towns. But on the Camino Francés, there's always, a village, a town, not too far ahead. So it may end up being an extra long day of walking, but you can usually find a place to find shelter. And there's, a variety of different options in most places. I think it's just, if you're really on a budget and you're wanting those really cheap hostels, that can be that may be a stressor if that's kind of your goal. But if you're willing to say, okay, I may end up having to pay a little bit more to stay in a private hostel or a B&B, I think you'll usually find a place. And I've also just met, lots of pilgrims who had some kind of remarkable experience of hospitality where, either through a local who lived along the route or through other pilgrims, they ended up finding a place that makes the Camino special, is kind of opening yourself up to allowing those kinds of experiences to happen.
Yeah. And as you say, just kind of letting that go a bit. But no, it's good to know that it is that Francés route, as you say, it's commercial enough now that there are other things that you can find places to stay. And what about food on the route? Because of course, like you said, you want to travel light. So you're not going to be carrying like a camping stove and all of that type of thing. So what are some of the food and drink options?
Oh, they are plentiful for the most part. One of the friends I traveled with jokingly called the Camino the Vino Camino because you can find, very good, inexpensive Spanish wine along the entire route. And there are lots of places to enjoy Spanish cuisine, which I think is one of the, kind of unique, interesting things about this. You're not really roughing it as far as, a culinary experience goes. And it's called the menu del dia, the menu of the day. A lot of the cafes and restaurants will have a special menu for pilgrims that's often discounted and kind of all inclusive. So that's something to look out for. And it's pretty affordable, and it allows you to try a lot of different, cuisine options without having to think too hard about it. You just order the pilgrim's menu for the day. So that is definitely, not something I think most pilgrims have to worry about. Food.
Yeah, I would say though that being vegetarian in Spain is difficult because it's a very meat-based culture, don't you think?
That is true. Yes, there's tortilla española, Spanish omelet is if you eat eggs is
yeah, you can't be vegan. Get away from cheese and eggs will never happen.
that would be a challenge for sure.
So just then on a budget that people might consider, because of course, again, I've thought about this. So to do the full 600, it might be 6 weeks, 7 weeks if you need a bit of extra rest along the way, which for many people is a pretty big trip. So what would people be spending, of course, if they weren't staying in private accommodation every night, but equally, were not living a completely basic life?
Yeah, so I walked back in 2011, so I always have to factor in exchange rates and all of that. But if I remember correctly, the municipal hostels, I think you could get a bed for, I want to say between like 12 and 15 euros a night. I don't know if that's changed. I imagine the prices have gone up since 2011.
It sounds about right. Yeah, in, I would have said maybe 20 euro, which is about $18 maybe?
Yeah, yes. Did I say pounds or did I say euro?
Yeah, you said euro. It's fine.
Okay. I meant to say euro. Yes. So I would say you probably, can budget about 20 euros for accommodations, unless of course you want to stay in a private room, or, in a nice B&B, it's going to be a bit more.
Yeah. And then food on top of that, what would do 10 euros?
I think so. If you stick with the pilgrim menu of the day, maybe between 10 and 15 euros.
Yeah, exactly. So basically we're saying it's not a luxury holiday. We're talking, no. which is great. Okay, so then I just want to ask you. You mentioned that it was sociable. You met someone who walked from Germany, and obviously you meet different people every day. But what to me, see, I'm married, and the thought of 6-7 weeks away from my husband is difficult, and yet I think it should be done alone. So what are your thoughts on doing it alone or in a group, and also on meeting people along the way?
I agree. I think there is something very powerful about doing it alone. I did walk with friends, and it was a wonderful experience to share together. But the very kind of extreme introvert in me at times longed for a little more solitude. And there's definitely stretches on the Camino where it's a bit more secluded. And since you do have a good idea of where you're going to end up at the end of the day, you usually have a point that you think you're going to be able to reach. It's easy to get some solo walking time in and just, tell the people that you're walking with, you'll meet them in the next town at the end of the day. But I agree. The pilgrims I met who seem to have the most powerful experiences, or just they met the most interesting people, seem to be the ones who are walking alone. When you're walking in a group with other people, strangers don't tend to approach you as often, and so those who walked solo, they met all kinds of interesting people, and formed these kind of little communities along the way where they would see someone at the beginning of the route and then run into them again at the end. And their paths would kind of cross, but they were still, walking solo and had this time of solitude. So there's pros and cons to each, but walking the entire, 6 to 8 weeks alone is an experience I definitely want to have myself one day. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I'm 45. I still haven't done it, and it's and I'm like, I've got to do it. I've got to do it. It's going to be next year, and I keep thinking that, and I really feel I want to sort of achieve that. It's a really weird thing, isn't it? Though.
Yes. Yeah, and even if you did end up walking with someone, just kind of a practical tip. So the Scallop Shell is the symbol for the Santiago pilgrim, and you can see them. They're everywhere. They're sold all along the route. And so if you do end up walking with people, I think, having this shell that you can kind of use as your introverted symbol for when you need some alone time I found that was kind of a way to communicate to others. Like, I need to go off and walk by myself for a while if I was wearing the shell, without having to say like, hey guys, I want to be alone. And so, coming up with some kind of symbol or way to communicate with those you're walking with as, now is time for my Camino solitude, can maybe be a way to kind of lessen tension if walking with other people.
Yeah, that's a good one. And I mean, of course, the other thing is some people don't have this as a life goal. So sometimes you end up doing it on your own because someone doesn't want to come too.
Very, very true.
But now I want to get into the idea of pilgrimage versus a long walk. Now, I mean, I'm not a Christian, but I consider myself spiritual, and I love monasteries and churches and nature, and I feel like it would still be a pilgrimage, even though I'm not a Catholic and I believe my sins will be forgiven or whatever. So what are some of the things that make the Camino a spiritual journey, even if they're not necessarily religious?
I think that's actually one of the most interesting things about the pilgrimage in, our current day, is the fact that it is, rooted in Christianity and in Catholicism, and it feels very medieval. But the modern pilgrims walking it today are people coming from all different backgrounds, different faiths, or no faith at all. So I think, you would never feel out of place. It's a very open and welcoming environment. As far as, the difference between a pilgrimage and a long walk, I think I actually just heard this quote yesterday. Tourists pass through places, places pass through pilgrims. And I love that. Tourists pass through places, places pass through pilgrims. And I think I'm still kind of trying to figure out what exactly all that means, but I think it really does describe what a pilgrimage is. So, a tourist, we're often looking to, maybe check off the boxes, to see certain things, to have certain experiences. We're very much in the driver's seat, and it's about reaching that destination. Whereas a pilgrimage is more about letting the places shape you, and it's more of this interior journey. And I think really, you'll meet pilgrims who keep going back. Oftentimes when we visit a certain place or complete a certain hike, we kind of feel like, okay, I've done that. I've achieved that goal. And I find it very interesting that the Camino, there's lots of people who return over and over again. And they'll describe it as addictive, actually. And I wonder if part of that is because it brings up, all these paradoxes and tensions that are just kind of part of being human. So it's both, it's a journey that's very physical, but it's also very internal. It's this time of solitude and introspection, but it's not, like hiking, in the Rocky Mountains where you're not going to see people. There's community as well, and there's a social aspect as well. And like we discussed, it's a very simple journey. It's not a luxurious experience, but there's also still creature comforts of great food and bottles of wine for €2. It's this marked route, so you can follow without really having to think too hard or do much planning. You can just follow it. And it's actually, more rewarding if you resist a strict itinerary. So there's all these kind of tensions and paradoxes, and it's just this very holistic experience where, mind, body, spirit, they're all brought together. And I think, that makes it a very human experience, and as a result, a spiritual one, regardless of what someone's background or beliefs are.
Yeah, and I think, and I don't know where my attraction to it came from, but it's old. I must have read about it at a young age, and feel an attraction to it on so many levels. So that's fantastic. So is there, I guess your books, obviously, you've got Wisdom for the Way, which I think has both storytelling aspects and also some spiritual side of it as well. Are there any other books that you recommend about the Camino or pilgrimage?
Yes, there's actually there are many books about the Camino, and it's a very popular topic for memoirs. So a more recently published memoir about the Camino that I'd suggest is Walking to the End of the World by Beth Justino. And she's interesting because she maybe like you isn't walking the Camino for a reason of faith, or that's not her primary motivation. So it was very interesting to read about the pilgrimage through her experience. For anyone interested in the actual history of the Camino, you can actually read a 12th century guidebook written, I think it was by a monk in the 12th century who walked the Camino and documented his experiences of different locations. So that's called The Pilgrim's Guide to Santiago, and there's a version of it edited by William Meltzer, and that's easy to find on Amazon or other places. And then another book that isn't about the Camino or even about pilgrimage in particular, but just is about walking and its role with how it influences our creativity. It's a very just interesting philosophical book. It's called The Old Ways by Robert Macfarlane. And I'm about halfway through that one, and it's wonderful.
Oh, he is amazing. He's like a national treasure here in the UK. I'm actually reading his Underland at the moment, which is completely not about walking. It's about what's under the earth and caving and graves and things like that. But he is probably one of our best nature writers. So I'm glad you recommended that book.
Well, I just discovered him, and I was like, I bet he is very well known in the UK, but he's brand new to me, and it's been a wonderful introduction.
Yeah, well, I can recommend all his books. He's a beautiful writer. He's actually one of those writers I'm like, oh, I just can't write any other book ever because he's so amazing.
We all have those.
The imposter syndrome. Yes. Fantastic. So obviously you have travel in your background and in your life, but what does travel mean to you in a broader sense, both to you personally, I guess, and to your writing process?
Yeah, well, like I've said, I think it's in my story, it's in my upbringing, it's in my background. And so that's definitely part of it. I don't really, I think those of us who have this wanderlust, it's hard to know where it comes from, why we have it. Because my sisters have the same exact, I have two sisters. They had the same upbringing that I had, and they've, spent most of their adult years in one place. So, the wanderlust bug didn't bite them as it did me. But as far as, travel and in my creative process, I'm a very driven person in normal life, and I can easily get tunnel vision when it comes to my goals and pursuing them. And, travel, it just really helps me slow down and see and notice things that I wouldn't otherwise notice. It makes me feel like I'm in my body instead of just in my head all of the time. It is, it allows me to capture certain emotions. And so it's definitely influenced my writing more than anything else. Everything I've written, every novel, manuscript, there are always, memories that even if I don't include, even if the book isn't set in a certain place and I'm, in a very literal way, recounting a certain experience or a certain scene, a certain place, the memories of my travels and the emotions that certain experiences produced, those get brought into the fiction in some way, even if they look very different from what the original experience was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just tend to kill people in my locations. So
you're looking for new ways to kill people in different places.
Well, one of the reasons I feel like I would do the Camino and write 2 books. I mean, similar to how you have, but I would write some kind of thriller and probably then a memoir as well, which would be different. But it feels like it would generate both story and introspection about the world.
Yes. I can see like a very The Name of the Rose kind of thriller set on the Camino. That would be a book I would want to read. For sure.
There we go. I'm reserving that one. But I do like what you said there about, travel and probably walking a long way as well as, being in your body and not your head. I feel this is so important for modern life. We can travel through our phones, by holding our phones near our faces, but, by actually moving your body in a new culture, in a new setting, can just be so different to looking up pictures of that place.
Yes, I agree. It's, Pinterest and YouTube, they're great for doing research for writing, but there is something about, I think it's the emotional connection. It's not just the description, but the way you felt about it, the way you feel about a certain location, a certain encounter with a colorful character that you meet in your travels. That those are the real treasures that we can gain from traveling as creative people. Fantastic.
So where can people find you and your books online?
Well, you can find me, you learn more about me on my website, ashleecowles.com. I'm on Instagram at the same name, and my books are available, on Amazon and pretty much all the usual online places.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time, Ashlee. That was great.
Thanks, Jo. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining me today on the Books and Travel podcast. I hope you found a moment of escape. You can find the episode show notes at booksandtravel.page. And if you enjoy thrillers set in international locations, download one of my books for free at jfpenn.com/free. Happy travels until next time.